Okay, we are now streaming live, so I think all the technicalities have been achieved. So first of all, welcome to the first meeting of the municipal year of the Climate and Environment Panel of the Scrutiny Committee. We'll move quickly on. Alice, any apologies?
Yeah, we have apologies from Councillor Dunn, and that's all the apologies we've received.
No substitutions. Okay, any declarations of interest? I'm going to just declare one. I don't think it's certainly not pecuniary interest, just to be clear. As well as a councillor, I'm chair of the Cripley Meadow Allotment Association, which is the largest allotment association in the city. Couple of the recommendations, or certainly one of the recommendations under item 6 touches on things that allotment associations may or may not do in their may or may not allow in their rules. Insofar as that's an interest, I'm declaring it. Any other declarations of interest?
Following your suit, then, I am a member of Eastward Allotments.
I think if you're just a member, that's very different. Yeah, I think that's
fine.
different to being I'm chair and trustee, so
That's
I
fine.
think that's
Thank you.
responsibility. Anybody else? No, I have no announcements, so that's item 3 done. Item 4, Emily and Catherine, you were present at the meeting, obviously. So can I ask you to confirm that the minutes are a correct record?
Yes, I confirm that.
Excellent, thank you very much indeed. Seeing nods and yeses from both. So are there any matters arising out of those that we're not touching on elsewhere? I think not. So that takes us to item 5, which is our panel's work plan. So very brief introduction from me on this. There was an informal session of the panel in the last municipal year, which came up with a list of a lot of different topics which the panel could look at. I talked to Alice about that and then put them under headings so that there was some kind of structure. And then Alice has assessed them, and I'm going to ask her just to explain the topic TOPIC criteria and the weighting she's put on the different things.
Yeah, thank you. Topics, so I'll go through them one at a time. So T is for timely, so that's asking questions about, is now the best time to consider that item? Are there legislative or policy changes afoot that mean that it's relevant to consider those issues now? And or is the issue due for an inspection or an audit? So they're the questions that we look at with regard to those, and then you give it a score based on whether it's no, somewhat, or yes. O is for Oxford priority, so that's about the added value. Is it a local priority? And then you get a score based on that. P is for public interest, simply is it of significant public interest, and then you get a score. I is for influence, which is questions around, will input drive outcomes and change, or will it be sort of unwelcome and lack impact? And then C is for cost, and that's whether the service or decision incurs high income expenditure or savings, with a view to prioritising those services or decisions where there is a high income expenditure or saving. So within the Appendix A, the shaded areas, the shaded items, sorry, are the ones that scored most highly. So they were actually in double figures when I did the scoring. If the panel disagrees with that scoring, it's not sort of hard and fast. You can sort of make your case for other items just for awareness. Yes, and then the Appendix A also includes some standard and regular items which the panel may wish to ask me to get scheduled in with officers.
Okay, thank you very much. So a couple of kind of starting points before we go into a broader discussion. We've got 5 meetings during the year, of which this is already the first, so we've only got 4 left. I think we need to be mindful of that when coming up with a list. So I think we probably want 4 or 5 items from the list. And the rolling items, I think, be useful just to hear your reflections on those, how useful there are. There is a danger, I think, if you have rolling items that you end up, spending a lot of time talking about the same things, not necessarily adding value. But clearly, with some of these things are substantial items, and therefore it's helpful to have an element of kind of regular examination of them. I think we're probably safe to assume that everything on this list is pretty much Oxford specific. I also would say the majority of the items on the list are in the public interest, and cost we could tie ourselves in knots, because some of the things we're talking about have costs running into hundreds of millions, and other things could be quite minimal. I think it's quite difficult for us to kind of judge on cost. So particularly want to focus in on things which are timely and things where we can influence, and in particular, where we can add value. We could have a lovely time talking about things which are interesting to us if we're not adding value to what the council does or what the broader community experiences. We've not really contributed anything positive. So don't worry about sticking hands up, just interject. So what are your thoughts?
Can I start?
Yes, of course.
So firstly, I'm really impressed with the work, and thank you, Alex and Alice specifically for having gone through this. I think it's really clear. I like the way you've looked at it, and yeah, great. It gives us a really clear structure. So then one point, just to challenge the way we've decided this, I wonder if there's a component of things that Oxford can really lead on across the UK. And apologies, Alice, if that came through in one of the topic categories. But should we, I know our responsibility is to Oxford, but actually, should we also be looking at things where we can really drive meaningful change across the UK in terms of what we do here in Oxford? Open question, maybe that's not within our scope. But yeah, so I suppose that's probably the main thing. And then, are we looking at specifics yet or not?
I think we are looking at specifics. I'd be interested in Catherine's view on whether we wish to be leading edge across the country and so on, how that fits in with the Oxford specific criteria. But be specific, please.
I would hope, excuse me, that whatever we do is leading in the UK. So it's and there's driving meaningful change on all of the topics related to climate and the environment. So I mean, I do recognise that point, but I'm not sure that whether that would whether that's going to change some of the prioritisation. I guess that is the first thing. In terms of the list and how the prioritisation has happened, and again, just to reiterate the thanks in pulling this together, there are a few things that are on the list that I think haven't ended up being priorities, but could have been merged together. And just to give, and there was also a point of clarification as well. So one point of clarification is around the EV charging. I understand that is something that there may be some responsibilities changing. Is that from city to county? So just wanted to clarify that. Because that isn't shaded, but certainly residents would be wondering why we're not talking about that. And then on the topic of merging some of the points together, I think that, like, for instance, the solar potential on council buildings and then the solar canopies on car parks, I know that the starting point is energy generation on one point or transport on the other, but actually the topic in itself is pretty similar. We have control over the car parks, and so it's about there is that. In terms of very specific topics, I'm pleased that air pollution is coming up, and there were some different angles on that I wanted to just clarify whether we're going to be taking in the next meeting, or whether they would be separate items. I mean, I'll pause there, but I can come back to that.
I'll pause there just to clarify on a couple of sort of points of principle. So my views on the points raised, I think it's good to try and establish where Oxford can be leading edge. I think we also ought to focus on where we think we're dragging a little behind. And to be honest, there's probably a greater incentive to look at that. On things like EV charging, I don't want to get into a lengthy discussion on it. The issue here is there is an ongoing programme at work. Are we going to add anything helpful. I mean, we could talk about it, but I think we potentially could argue that the council knows what it's supposed to be doing. It, you know, it needs to get on and do it, and so that's a different kind of conversation. Solar potential was going to be one of mine. Just to be clear, we don't have control over all the car parks. Several of them the council doesn't own, but the solar potential, the energy generation, I was going to just sort of push on that and see whether we could come up with an umbrella item for power generation, as it were, as we go forward. So I think, with those provisos, I think we can probably start to pick out 4 or 5 things. So Emily, you had some specifics, I think, and then we kind of like just checked around the table, as it were. So where were your specifics heading you? Taking
so actually the real one was probably around waste management. So if we did want to be, you know, that's where we really are leading in the UK, and so I just know, as you say, Alex, there may not be much that we need to do that we can add value on, but it does seem like an area that we already are, you know, not as good as Wales, but really doing very well on. Having said that, that may not make it suitable for this panel, but so that was just one thought. I agree with both of you on solar, if possible. I'm conscious of not wanting to raise too many topics. And I just wanted to thoroughly support your message around tree planting, because I actually have tried to plant trees recently. It is extremely difficult to do. And I think that is due to the tensions. And additionally, as you probably saw, County Cabinet last week voted to kind of allocate 2.6 million to more tree planting for climate defensive reasons, because I believe that across the county, 4,000 trees have been removed and only 300 have been replaced. Now, I realise we're running into yet another city versus county responsibility boundary, but it feels like that is very much timely, you know, in terms of budget allocation and how we think about in the longer term kind of, you know, resistance to climate change as well. So here to say potentially waste, agree with you on solar, and very much I think tree planting is an area we can add value.
So, Catherine, you wanted to pick up on air pollution, just on some specifics on that?
Yeah, some specific angles. One is the issue of smoke nuisance from waterways, and I realise that this is a difficult debate, but it's also a timely one. So, can we pull this into the discussion about air quality at the next meeting? There is also, we have the Auxerre project, which I was one of the participants in, and it was a joint project a few years ago, but wanted to understand also whether we've implemented any of the recommendations that have come from that, whether there's any information connected to it. And then the issue of traders using diesel generators, I think it's not a topic in itself that we would be examining thoroughly. And there is, again, this crossover of responsibilities, but it possibly would make sense to deal with that also in light of the air quality report next time. It's not a detailed item, but I think Councillor Upton's on the call, and it came up in a licensing.
So I think in terms of items we might want to touch on, can I sort of start heading us towards a list then? So can I suggest, I think we're all in agreement on the trees, and what I would suggest, in just sort of adding to my email that I sent to you, would be something on the lines of the council has a tree strategy. It dates from 2016, and actually it dates from 2008. So it's a very it's a venerable document. It focuses on issues around maintenance. It does focus on biodiversity, so that's important, but it has nothing in it on climate change, and in particular climate mitigation, which is very important from an urban design perspective. And since the tree policy was enacted, the council has created ODS. There's now a split in responsibilities between ODS as a contractor, between the council as a client, and obviously both Emily and I have had the experience of trying to get a street tree installed, and it seems to me that probably what we've both been told is not in line with the policy from 2016, which indicates that the policy has, as policies do, changed and bent and altered to reflect new financial realities. So I think there's a piece of work we can do around that, which I think would be helpful. The value we can add is input into a new strategy to assess how the council is looking at it across the different divides, and indeed, as you've said, the city-county divide issue with the county councils, the transport authority. So I think that's one. I think there is indeed something around charging generation, solar potential. I was thinking the commercial buildings that the council owns, we've got a substantial portfolio. I think we probably need to take that one away and just think a little bit about how we manage that. We don't want to come up with a lengthy set of recommendations that the council can't move with. So I think if we can say we want to do something around the generation side of things, and see where we go on that. Air pollution, I think probably what I would suggest there is that those Oxair recommendations, Catherine, that would be the starting point. I think it's a very valid role for scrutiny to hold, to go, those recommendations that came forward X months or years ago, how are we progressing on them? And that seems to be probably quite a good framework to hang a discussion around, if that's okay. So that would be three.
And I just added that since our latest AQAP or whatever, which was approved in 2021, obviously Chris Whitty published the report on air pollution, and there's quite a lot of focus there on indoor air pollution, and I've been thinking quite a lot about this. I don't really know how relevant that is, but we have some world-leading air quality indoors experts in Oxford, so it just feels like there may be something beyond the Oxair recommendations that could also be included in this. Just throwing that out.
Yeah, and I think that's probably a good example of where we need to think about. We can certainly, I mean, in Oxford, we can always access expertise. It's kind of relatively easy for us. The issue is what would we do with that?
Yes.
What value would we be adding? And that might focus in on our role as a landlord, as a housing landlord, and whether indoor air quality is an issue there. But we need to think about that. So if we're okay to sort of take that away and have a think about where we head with it, that would be useful. Emily, while you have the floor, you said waste and suggested we potentially already doing quite a good job on that. What could we add?
Yeah, I mean, that is a great question. I suppose this isn't really an area of expertise, it's of mine. It strikes me frequently that there are very different systems across city and our districts in terms of waste, and there are in many, whenever you go anywhere different, the waste system is different. So, but I'm not sure that is a job for this panel necessarily. I suppose I'm just thinking about, if you think about waste more broadly, we appear to do a very good job. How can we be pushing legislation, or like the government's ability to allow us to set legislation in waste? And is this something that we should be doing? But again, I think it's probably outside of the scope of this panel. It just struck me when I was reading the list previously that.
No, I had a similar thought process. I thought, oh, that sounds very interesting, and I thought, what could we actually do?
Yeah, which is a great challenge.
Yeah. Mish Tullah is offering his thoughts.
Yes, thank you, Chair. On this specific point, actually, I think there may be an opportunity. It certainly wouldn't be, I'm afraid, around influencing government legislation. We're really up to eyeballs now in late lobbying of government, using all of the available channels, in particular the district councils network, to influence the shape of the proposals that come through from DEFRA. So they're changing the whole structure of the waste collection and disposal sort of system that we have in the UK. And some of those changes are potentially very sort of soon upon us in the next couple of years. What we will need to do when we get clarity on the final set of proposals is to review how we should potentially adjust our system, both here in the city but also county-wide, best to respond to those new requirements. it's really difficult looking at it without all of the detailed information. When we get there, we'll have to make some potentially quite significant decisions, which could include, for example, changing the whole of our collections fleet, because it's possible that rather than the dry mixed recycling that we currently do, which you stick in the back of one single large recycling vehicle, you might want to have separated recycling as they currently do in West Berkshire. And if we do that, and that is how it is going to be most effective, then obviously there'll be a procurement challenge and so on and so on. So I think actually, Chair, in once we've actually got the sort of the clarity from government, which we're told should be in months, not years now, then I think it may be something that we are, as officers, are going to have to work hard to sort of come up with solutions, and we're going to need to have a lot of eyes on the proposals.
Yeah, I think probably, given the potential impacts of that, I would suggest that's something that the main scrutiny committee wants to look at, because it's as much about operations as it is about climate and environment issues. And there's a company's obviously crossover issue, and there's a county-wide issue. So let's watch this space. Catherine.
Yeah, just a few angles on the waste. One is sort of commercial waste from the shops and the hospitality sector within the city, and how we can influence that. Also, what I'm finding in conversations with schools in my ward is, a lot of them are residential. You've got lots of boarding schools, and basically catering is a big thing for them. So there's waste in the kind of that the hospitality business, but including the school side of things. The connection also to some of this waste from the hospitality sector sort of relates to the whole issue of tourist tax. And I know Manchester apparently put something in place related to that, and I know it seems a little indirect, but to the environmental impact, but it is an environmental problem, and so maybe there's a connection to that wider topic, whether it's dealt with as scrutiny more broadly or environment scrutiny. And then the other element is, if we're going to become a denser city overall, do we want to explore as part of any waste strategy also the aggregation of waste and these underground waste solutions, how to deal with waste in a more densely occupied city, in the Netherlands, in Amsterdam, they go underground. I know that we've talked about this previously, Alex. So those are different angles that we might want to look at, but as you said, it might not be appropriate for us to discuss in this forum, but elsewhere.
Well, can I suggest we kind of park it as a possible? I think if depending on what the government proposes, we could be talking something really very fundamental for the authority and authorities across the country, particularly across the county. There may be very different ways of doing things. So that probably seems like a sort of good trigger point is to wait and see what they put forward. I don't think anyone's going to be wanting to make any significant investment in new systems until we've got an idea about what the government might be coercing everyone into doing. So we can have a watching brief on that one. We may never come to it, but let's sort of pencil it for later in the year. But we could get usurped by the main scrutiny committee who may wish to look at it. So just summing where we are then, I have trees, I've got the charging solar panels issue, the Ox-Air recommendations as a hook on which to hang an air pollution discussion, but that can certainly pick up issues around the specific things that you were mentioning, Catherine. One of the other items which was a high priority, and it's a very broad brush one, but the council policies, projects and actions. There's quite an interest. I mean, those are interestingly broad. So a strategic look from a climate and environment perspective, ensuring they're up to date, relevant, so on and so on. That scored highly on the rating system, but I think we need to be specific about what we want to pick out of those things around management. So one area I thought perhaps we ought to focus in on because there's an obvious crossover with biodiversity, is on things around parks management. What's our approach to parks? What's our approach to policy? I think certainly in discussion with cabinet members, the fact there are 3 different regimes for no mow may kind of, is a cause of customer confusion and citizen confusion. So how we got the kind of procedural things. So what I'm looking at perhaps is more the operational things, the action plans that stem from the strategies, if we can focus in on those. And a specific one of those, which I think was first raised by, I'm trying to think who it was, one of the North Oxford councillors certainly, which is around how land set aside for biodiversity net gain from planning is managed. I think everybody acknowledges this is a new thing and involves systems and processes. So we don't want to look at how it's being managed, but how it's being monitored, how we keep a log of it, what we judge success on, all those kinds of things, how those kinds of areas fit in. So those seem to me to be 2 areas we could potentially look at, and an element of crossover between the 2. Is that okay? Which makes 5 if we do one on our kind of parks and green spaces management and one on biodiversity net gain management.
Mm-hmm. Can I just clarify that the retrofit, which came as number 1, because we're talking about some of that today anyway, are you looping that into a little bit in today's technical advice discussion, or
yes,
we
that
wanted
is
a separate?
Yeah, let's see where we go with the discussion today. I think that's a good point, because what we've got today is a specific element of that. Let's have a look at the discussion today, and depending on what the recommendations are, we may want to come back to it in a more broad sense. That's a very valid point, so let's include that one as well. Right, so just wrapping up.
Just
go ahead.
One more. Alice, can I just check why further leisure centre decarbonisation was on the list? Because it feels like that might be one of those topics that is kind of proceeding, but it felt like you might. How can we add value to that?
Well, this is my sense, and why I've not put it forward is that there's been substantial investment in doing a considerable degree of decarbonisation. I think it's true to say that across the country, the leisure sector is still struggling to recover from COVID and the shutdown, and the fact that a lot of operators weren't supported financially, and indeed, if they've had loans, having to pay them back. So I'm thinking it's probably sensible just to wait and see where we are. The council's kind of exploring its options for tendering at the moment. So I think I would probably wait on that one until we've got a clearer sense of where we are more broadly with the service, and then interject if we think we can add value.
Completely agree. And the only thing to add into that, which isn't relevant to this panel probably, is just around how we're thinking about scope 3 emissions in terms of leisure centres, because leisure centres strike me as being a very good way of avoiding transport emissions, and yet I bet that, having looked at scope 3 from a kind of business perspective, I would imagine that's probably not included in how they count as decarbonised. But the fact is that people live locally to leisure centres, and all leisure types of I don't know, like the splash park or whatever as well, not just leisure centres. So just, I don't know if that's being considered as part of the decarbonisation of leisure centres, but probably it should be, that they save transport emissions elsewhere. But I'm
Sounds
not
dangerously like a 15-minute city.
I enjoyed your comments to Bloomberg on that topic.
Yes.
Quite right.
Right. So, Alice, are you happy that what we've got is something along these lines? Trees, charging, Oxair recommendations as part of a broader thing to hang air pollution issues on, parks, sort of strategy and action plans thereof, the management of biodiversity net gain from planning, and then retrofit more broadly than just heritage. And that gives us 6 things plus our regular items.
It's less charging and more solar, right, Alex? It's not EV.
Yeah, solar is, sorry, yes, it's charging. It's generation of electricity.
But very specifically not EV charging.
Yeah, that's right.
Cool.
Yeah, perfect.
Lovely. That's our action plan then. Right. Apologies for all the officers and cabinet members who had to sit through that. We found it very interesting. We hope you did too. So item 6 is a report back on recommendations. We have the cabinet comments. Is there anything that any members of the panel want to raise about those responses, or can we just note them and move on? We can note them.
No, just 1 second. So on, sorry, just on page 23, on recommendation 3 about moving away from the use of chemicals, just wanted to clarify, because here it was saying that a further review of the use of herbicides and pesticides by ODS will be undertaken this year. I just wanted to clarify who will be leading on this, and you know, when is it this year? When is this happening this year? Do we know those details?
Is there anybody in the meeting who does know the details of that? I'm seeing Anna's hand up first.
Oh, I'll defer to Mish. He'll have a better answer.
In which case, Mish, please.
I was about to defer to Councillor Railton. Yeah, it's done. Is the short answer. So it is done. We're to publish relatively shortly. Councillor Railton has reviewed the report that ODS has produced. I need to make sure that Councillor Chapman has done so similarly, but they will be published
soon. And just to clarify, since the report refers to pesticides and herbicides and then makes reference to a specific herbicide, the council does not use pesticides currently. Is that correct?
That is my understanding. Yeah, this is about herbicides.
Yeah. Okie doke. Right. So any moment now, I think, is the answer.
That's great. Yeah, thank you. And so then the follow-up was actually on the fleet decarbonisation recommendation around ODS exploring the use of electric cargo bikes in its fleet, and apparently these discussions are already taking place. I just wanted to clarify with whom, sort of, what kind of discussions actually are happening, because there's a very bland response and statement, so just wanted a bit more detail on what's going on there. Thank you.
Mish, you seem to be the response. Oh no, Mai is going to be.
Yes, I can share some details on what's gone on there. So actually, the Environment Sustainability team is supporting ODS in that. So we have had meetings with EAB, which is a local company that is creating cargo bikes, and they've actually done some cargo bikes for us in the covered market. So we're at that stage at the minute where it's exploring and looking at different vehicles and finding out what might work for them.
Thank you, that's helpful. I was in Westminster recently and I saw that they use cargo bikes for some of their street cleaning. So in case you haven't checked into with what they're doing to learn from their experience, it might be worth just seeing, where else they're using them already for similar purposes. But thank you, that's really helpful.
Right, thank you for that. So that takes us to item 7. We have Louise Upton and Anna Railton, 2 cabinet members responsible for planning broadly and environmental things broadly. And in terms of officers, I'm going to have to try and squint to see who we have. We have a lot of officers from both the planning team and from the environment and sustainability team. I'm not going to name everyone, seems to be such a large number, but thank you all very much indeed for coming. I'm going to invite 2 cabinet members who can defer immediately, should they so wish, to officers for a brief, with the emphasis on the word brief, introduction, and then we will move to comment and discussion. So Louise Upton, I think you look like you're poised and ready to roll, so over to you.
I am. Thanks, Alex. Yes, just to say that it's quite unusual, I think, to bring something kind of as lowly as a technical advice note to a scrutiny panel, but you've asked for it to come, and I think it could be really useful to get your ideas and input into it as well. So I think very glad to bring it here. Of course, it's coming in the middle of rewriting our local plan, getting our new local plan, which will have separate actual policies on building efficiencies and also on retrofitting. So this document here, I'm the long title, Carbon Reduction and Sustainable Retrofit Guidance for Historic Buildings, is intended as a helpful guide for residents who are thinking about, retrofitting their home. So it's not supposed to be exhaustive, but and I think we probably anticipate it will need updating before the next local plan round happens. So it's meant to be fairly sort of fleet of foot, but we'd like to get it out as soon as possible because we get queries about this all the time. So I'm now on that note going to hand it over to, I think, Dan, who's written the technical aspects of it, is going to give you a bit of an outline of it. Thanks.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I'm Dan, a principal planner in the policy team. Yeah, so as Councillor Upton says, the local plan 2036 sets out the policies, our planning framework that's then supported by these technical advice notes. So the idea is these don't create new policy, they're there to basically kind of support applicants in interpreting our policies and basically give them extra helpful guidance. The impetus for updating this TAN, there was a couple of reasons really. I think, we were aware that there was a desire for some greater clarity on this issue. It's a complex topic. National policy is quite fluffy in some regards on this as well. But also to try and bring it closer in line to the direction of travel with net zero and our targets there. And this kind of acts as a sort of a bridge as we move towards the new local plan. So we've updated this and tried to be as collaborative as we can be, really, drawing in expertise from the environmental sustainability team, also our heritage colleagues, and then kind of as it's been developing, we've shared it with some members of the ZCOP to get their feedback on it too. Essentially, it's one tool in the toolbox that we can kind of put out there to help applicants on this topic. So the TAN itself, just quickly to kind of cover that off, we've tried to kind of restructure the previous version that was there, make it shorter, try and make it a bit clearer for people. It sets out all the kind of the different aspects that DM officers have to take into account when they get these kind of applications, and then sets out a process for applicants to follow to try and give them the best chance of a successful application, really. So it sets out, it follows the structure of the energy hierarchy. It really makes this point of actually trying to understand your building, what are the special historic features that it is protected for, but then also how is it performing in terms of energy efficiency and this kind of thing. And the focus is on energy because that tends to be the biggest kind of source of carbon emissions once a building's in operation. So then it takes you through 3 sort of steps that follow the energy hierarchy. That's about driving fabric efficiency as much as possible first, then what energy you're using in terms of heating and that, trying to use the most efficient system, and then meeting your needs renewably. And the idea is you follow these steps down, and in theory, it doesn't tell you that one particular technology is the perfect solution. Every single building is going to be different, but it tries to kind of give you that process to think through. And yeah, as Councillor Upton says, once the new policies come into effect, this is going to have to be updated again. We're trying to kind of, sort of bridge the gap here. I think that's a good enough overview, hopefully. Should we open it up to questions?
To unmute myself, thank you very much. So we've got the basic introduction. I think probably the one thing I would flag to my fellow panel members is to not disappear into technical weeds here. There are experts on how to retrofit historic buildings, and we are not they, at least unless I'm very much misunderstanding all of our professional expertise. I think what I'm very interested in is what's the experience of somebody wanting to set about doing this, and whether Oxford City Council is making that a positive experience for them. So whose hand is up? It's Emily's.
Hi Dan, thank you. Firstly, this looks clear and structured and useful. I have a question around curtilage and the kind of wider context. Curtilage is mentioned briefly, and the kind of the wider context of the garden. And this may not fall within our remit, but this paper does mention the kind of the relevance of curtilage and just the, I guess, net zero implications of, for example, cutting down a load of trees and whacking a load of concrete there in order to support EVs. that within scope. Basically, there seems to not be much about curtilage, and that may be because it doesn't fall within scope, or it may be because it's not our job. But yeah, could you clarify?
Yeah, I mean, it's an important issue. I think the key challenge with this, and if you look at the previous TAN that's currently up, it's a really big document. It's really technical. I think our focus on this has been on the kind of energy use of the building and very much focusing on that element. That's not to say that other stuff isn't important. And you know, we've got other technical advice notes out there that maybe there's something we need to look at in there. But yeah, does that answer your question?
Sort of. It does mention curtilage as a heritage asset, I suppose. Yeah, I just don't know if there's it says nothing about gardens, basically. But I suppose if they don't consume energy, so maybe that's not supposed to be relevant. But
a garden's unlikely to be a heritage. Yeah, garden's unlikely to be a heritage asset unless it's actually specifically protected.
Yeah, and I should say I'm not a heritage expert here. I guess, you know, part of the curtilage, it's part of this thing of context is as much an important part of understanding why a building is listed, and particular conservation areas and this kind of thing. So if you're doing stuff sort of kind of, I guess, kind of to the fabrics of buildings and the external areas, that's maybe where it is of some relevance when you're kind of going out that way. Yeah, David, have you got anything to add on that?
Well, I was just going to say, within the TAN, where it does talk about curtilage, it talks about buildings within the curtilage rather than the curtilage per se. So you're right, it's a retrofit TAN rather than anything else. That the more holistic part, like you quite rightly raised, kind of the impact on a garden, is to be considered, but not really within the scope of this TAN, in an effort to try and keep it usable. There'll always be points where, you know, we're saying, you know, if you've got something complicated, you want to do something that's slightly off-piste, get in touch, get involved, use the pre-application process so we can help guide people as best we can.
Catherine, I can see all the hands, but I'm going to go around the panel first.
So first of all, the message that you communicated about this is going to have to be updated when the local plan's updated. I think that would be really useful to have kind of clear at the front. So because I think some of the questions or points that I'd like to communicate actually relate to the wider policy context and what our policies are, what defines the values that we're making some of the judgments on around this. And I think when a resident will be reading this, they might question some of those values as it currently stands, and they might hold different values, but actually, you know, those values are going to be changed, those policies will be changed, and so that would be helpful. But
can
really,
you just be specific about what you mean, just so to make it easy for the officers?
Yeah, so I mean, there is, so with the, just to explain upfront that there's going to be, some of this will change based on the policies. There is a statement that specifically says, around what are the values that contribute to the importance and how would these values be affected by the intervention. And I think it's this debate that we've had previously around, are we valuing heritage over environment more in terms of what we think is a significant, it is a significant, I can't find the exact word, in terms of the level of harm that is being caused, whether it's substantial or not, and whether. Can I just
pause you there, because I think those are things which are not going to be changed by any local plan because they're set in the National Planning Policy Framework. So, David, if you're there, could you just confirm whether they are within scope for any local plan to address?
There may be some scope to tilt the balance slightly. But I think the point about making it clear at the beginning of this TAN that this is a, for want of a better word, a bridging document, I don't think we'll use that language within it, but that it gets updated to be the most, I was going to say carbon friendly. I don't mean like least carbon friendly sort of document that we can. We can affect some wording to that level. I mean, it's very difficult, as you say, the NPPF. You know, we might be able to find a way of articulating some of those woollier points like Dan was mentioning earlier and sort of changing the dial a little bit on there, but obviously some of it is within scope, and a lot of it is outside of scope.
Okay, Catherine, sorry about that. Just wanted to clarify that before we.
Yeah, I mean, so just to give you a concrete example, I understand that there is possibilities for like local development orders, for instance. Like, is it Kensington and Chelsea have given sort of introduced a new planning order which gives consent for solar panels on most grade 2 and grade 2 star listed buildings without the need for individual listed building consent, for instance. And I understand that, yeah, so there are ways and means that there are mechanisms there. We could look at reviewing some of the conservation areas and whether with permitted the removal of permitted development rights, which is the case, as I understand it, on some of the areas like Jericho was mentioned, for instance. So I think some of my points relate to that. I do have some specific points on the actual content of the report, but these are the more like values-based policy framework questions and clarifications that I have.
So just so we can just check where we can go in terms of recommendations on something like that. So local development orders, who can answer that? A planner, probably.
Well, I suppose that the scope of the item in front of us is this TAN. So obviously bringing forward an LDO or reappraising conservation areas and Article 4 is beyond the scope of this document that's in front of us. But I think they're really valuable comments, which we'll happily take away. So personally, I don't think we'd be particularly precious that it's not in the TAN, and so we'll cover our eyes when we read it. But I think it isn't something that we could put into the TAN, but it's still a really valuable contribution that fits into that wider piece of work that we're obviously doing simultaneous to this.
Okay, so that sounds very much as if we can indeed make recommendations around that. And just to be clear to the panel members, the fact that the discussion is framed around the document is a device. The recommendations can go beyond that as long as they are ones that count. There's no point making recommendations that need government action to change, but things that the council can consider doing, I think, are perfectly legitimate. So, Catherine, I've kind of interrupted you twice now for clarification questions. Do you want to carry on?
Sure. Again, thank you, David, for clarifying those points, and I would like to come back to both of those in a moment. But just on the content of this report, then, and really thank you for it. But there are a couple of things I think could be useful to add. So one is a glossary. I mean, just that very basic. You probably got all of these terms defined elsewhere, but just it is still quite a heavy document. And in itself is possibly a disincentive for people to make the change. And we want them to do this. We want them to be installing solar, for instance, if they can, within the framework that is here. The other thing is around community projects. I've had an example of, and your team have worked with a street in my ward that have been looking at this, and there was some advice that was provided. But that possibly could be included in here as advice that other streets might want to explore. So could that be looked at? And then the other thing, and this isn't technical because I'm not a technical person in building retrofit or anything, but when you talk about some of the glazing, you don't refer to triple glazing, you just talk about more the secondary glazing. Does that include triple glazing? It's really a clarification on that. Thank you.
Could somebody just pick, Dan, possibly back to you, if you could just pick up that very specific point about the glazing?
I don't know, actually. If it doesn't, I can take it away and we'll have a look at it. Yeah, I think it talks about vacuum thin glazing because often that is the best way where windows particularly are, an important protective feature. That is often the recommendation from the heritage guys, but yeah, I'll take that away and have a look into it.
Okay, I'm just going to put a question to you, Dan, and anyone else who wants to have a stab at it, just to kind of point this in a particular direction. So first question I want to ask is just a kind of fact-finding mission question. What best practice did you seek out in drafting this? Where would you guide us to as an authority or authorities that do this well? And then I'm going to ask you what this is.
I would say quite a range of it. I mean, the topic is dealt with quite differently in different places. So looking at a few, you pointed out Bath before, which have had interesting guidance. Then looking at more kind of a lot of Historic England's work, stuff that's kind of coming forwards from the LETI and UKGBC. There's in the appendix there, I've kind of dumped in a few of those kind of the key references. But it's a fast evolving field as well. So if there's other guidance that you're aware of that you think we should flag up in here, I'd be interested to take that on board.
David's put his hand up.
I mean, obviously, I was just going to say, alongside that best practice, we obviously have a range of incredibly skilled and knowledgeable officers, both within the heritage team and the ES team as well. So we obviously need to frame whatever we do, not only in best practice, but in the very specific contexts that we have in Oxford as well. It's very difficult to simply take something off at somebody else's shelf and use it. Although obviously there's always good examples that we can sort of manipulate into our needs as well.
I've seen Anna's hand and I will come to you, don't fret. So the question I guess then I would ask of officers is what would be your understanding, your view of what the citizen experiences, the customer experience of dealing with this issue? We've got a substantial number of conservation areas as well as heritage assets, substantial numbers of heritage assets. Many of them are occupied by people or organisations who want to go about some kind of carbon retrofit for all manner of good reasons. What would your sense be of whether they are finding that an easy task, a difficult task, one that's productive, and what's the council contributing? So not what it like to contribute, what actually is it contributing to making that task an easy one?
Shall I pick that one up then? I think, frankly, it is difficult. I think the idea of this TAN is to help. It's not the only tool in our toolbox, as we've said that before. And there are, once we have the TAN in a position, where we can take on this advice and the comments from today and hopefully be able to publish it. And we've looked at different ways of, optimizing our website and in terms of allowing people to do kind of a flow through there so they can get guided into the best places. The reality is, like you say, it's a very complex situation and it's a very technical situation. So one size fits all kind of advice isn't, in our view, appropriate, because we want to make sure that we're really maximizing those opportunities in a changing environment. So I think probably for citizens and users of the Pioneers experience, it can be very difficult and it can be very, very complicated. We can demystify it to a point, but we've got a path to go on that, very much so.
I'll just add that, I mean, the hope with getting this out there, and I think we've kind of said in the document that we'd like to build on this in future, case studies, that kind of thing, potentially when the new TAN comes along. I think the benefit of getting it out there is then understanding if it's working for people, and actually using this as, it's kind of filling a gap where we know that there is a gap at the moment, and then understanding, is it working for people, and then can take that on board.
I suppose that I'll ask this last question and then we'll go to the people who've patiently been waiting their hands up. Question I suppose I'd put is if, as you say, it's difficult and it's complicated, would perhaps it be better to take into account, get a sense of the views of whatever people who are dealing with the system currently before publishing this, rather than publishing it and then seeing what happens?
I'm really sorry, Alex, I missed the beginning of that sentence. I've got some connectivity issues. Could you just
okay, Connor, the brief version of it. If the answer is we're going to publish it and see then what the customer experience is of using it, would the council not be better to look at the current customer experience and try and address it rather than the other way around?
I think we have tried to a degree through the ZCOP work. So partly actually, sharing this with people who are closer to the kind of the coal face of this, and we've tried to take that on board there. I think equally sort of discussing kind of internally, even with the conversations that the ES team are having with people out there and heritage colleagues. I think we've tried definitely to a degree to take that on board.
All right. Sorry, go ahead, David, and then I'm going to ask Anna and Mish to come in.
I was simply going to say the other part of the piece of work there, though, is that we have got behavioural insights in terms of the work that's been done on the website and where people are clicking and the FAQs and those kinds of things across all of the council, and obviously that includes our planning pages. It's a bit difficult to, you obviously are dealing with failure in that sense, where people are coming to us where they haven't found what they need. But we can wrap that in, and some of that where we're talking about, how we present it on the website, not just having it there as a static PDF, but having it with a bit more nuance and a bit more flexibility and interactivity with it. But the first part of that is obviously getting this bit over the line, and we risk not helping anybody for want of trying to help everybody. Does that make sense?
Catherine, you just put your hand up, so I'm going to call you because panel members are going to take priority for the moment. But is it on this specific issue, or shall I ask?
No, okay, if we can come back to me later.
Fine, okay. Anna, you patiently waited.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, so I'm kind of like going to act as like a fake panelist here. So I read this as if I was somebody. Well, I do live in a conservation area, and I am trying to do retrofit on this house. So yeah, I tried to read it through that lens, and I had a look at some other local authority examples of similar documents as well. So I just want to say, yeah, totally agree with Catherine that I think this needs a jargon busting section. What is an Article 4 direction? What is permitted development? What is listed building consent? Like there's a whole load of stuff which is very specific to conservation areas, which I think would be really helpful to have. So Oxford specifics. There are 18 conservation areas in Oxford, and a lot of them are conservation areas for different reasons. I'm in Littlemore. That's a conservation area because of the trees, largely. Jericho is a conservation area for very different reasons. I would genuinely super appreciate a table that was just like conservation area. And then along here, it's like, okay, you want to put solar panels on, you don't live in a listed building, is this permitted development? Is this? Is this? For example, I want to put a heat pump around the back of this house. This house is in a conservation area. I have literally no idea what I have to do about that. It's is there some obvious table that we can put together that basically is just like people can read off, okay, sure, I live in Jericho. This means I can never install solar panels right now. Oh, I got some really bad feedback. That I found that I think would be super useful. A super Oxford specific thing that I think would add quite a lot of value and would save a lot of people quite a lot of time. Other sort of Oxford specific stuff I'd love to see is one, Oxford case studies. Bath's document does a really good job of this, but I think maybe beyond that, Oxford examples of public benefits. While emphasizing that planning doesn't work like case law, I think it would be kind of helpful for people if actually it's like, okay, no, these people did do this, and it was seen as a public benefit for this reason. And I just had the thought while we were talking actually that Rose Hill and Iffley low carbon would actually be. So, Rose Hill isn't in a conservation area, Iffley is, but given they have a very strong building planning kind of focus, they probably would actually have genuinely quite insightful and useful feedback to give on this document. I've got some more non-Oxford specific stuff, so I'll just keep going.
Can I just pause? When you say you've got non-Oxford specific stuff, is this kind of going to tackle the failures of the planning system? Because
no, not that. So for example, many other documents in the retrofit space talk about whole house plans, and that is very much isn't mentioned at all in this document. and basically this is a plan that stays with the building. We're very, very relevant to a heritage building. I just wondered if we wanted to sort of lean into that a little bit more, given that it does appear to be a reasonably standard recommendation. From the Cambridge document, they talked about a need for an asbestos survey if it was a pre-2000 built house. We don't mention that at all. We don't really talk about mechanical ventilation in heritage properties, and I wondered why that is. And ditto, there's a reason about a variation of opinion about secondary glazing, while we seem to lean quite strongly into that. So I just wondered if there was any comments on that. And that, you'll be pleased to know, is all I've got.
Mish.
Thanks, Chair. I'm going to go back up to the sort of slightly more strategic question that you asked about the sort of the interface and experience of those that are seeking to use existing documentation and working to retrofit. So we absolutely, as you surmised, the ES team does of course have a lot of regular discussions with many partners in that space. I think it would be fair to say, and I know that my planning colleagues recognise that the experience is probably mixed. And in helping sort of shape the document, my team has been sort of directly involved, and the interface that Dan has already referenced with ZCOP was part of that to get input. More specifically, there's been sort of dialogue back and forth with Low Carbon Hub, who, as of course, all will recognise are sort of kind of leaders in terms of doing retrofit work in the city. We, as has been observed, this perhaps doesn't go as far as they have in some places. Kensington, Chelsea was mentioned. But I think that the urgency of getting something out, given the increased interest and levels of demand for retrofitting, which, because of the costs of doing works like that, perhaps it isn't an accident that there is often an overlap with our conservation areas as well. That we're all gearing up in discussions with Low Carbon Hub about the next stage of the pioneering places. We that's a government funding round, which we won the first round with, and we will be almost certainly making an application for the second round this autumn. That's these are sort of projects, but they're all about seeing what more can be done in this space. Clearly, we want to try and provide us a sort of positive a planning environment for those types of actions to go forwards.
Okay, Catherine, your hand is still up for the thing to explore in the future, isn't it?
Yeah, just on case studies though. If we're
yes,
having
go with case studies. Yeah. Yeah,
case studies. We've got Wolfson's case study, which I think is a great example that can separately, if not within the time frame of this, be sort of documented. They in fact have some public information on that, so it might be that you can already lift or cross-reference what they have done that's in the public domain.
Yeah, I think the point I was going to pick up on case studies at the moment, we've got institutional case studies, but I think we've only got one domestic one. And what we're talking about, people who are struggling most with this, is probably the domestic ones who can't afford, a team of heritage architects to help them through the process. I think some more examples there. I just wanted to pick up, going back to the contrast between different approaches in different places. So the question was asked. I'm absolutely not picking on you at all here, Dan, for not knowing the answer to this question, the one about triple glazing. But if you look at the Bath and North East Somerset approach to this, not only can you immediately identify what is the council's likely response to triple glazing, which is, we don't really approve, we'd much prefer you did something else, but it's part, so the information is there, it's easily accessible, you can find it in seconds, but it also is indicative, I think, of an approach which is much clearer in terms of, maybe not to a straight yeses and nos. I don't think we're ever going to get in the British planning system to a tick box exercise, but there is much greater clarity about what the council's position is. And I have to say, and this won't come as a surprise to David and others, as you know, is the sense I have is that we, as a city council, tend to respond, I think this is probably fair, by sucking our teeth and go, that's difficult, that is, every time we get one of these issues. And as we've got 20 odd conservation areas, that those conservation areas are different. I think the point that Anna was making, however one did it, I think is absolutely right. I think we are creating barriers to retrofit in our conservation areas and in our heritage assets. And it's the conservation areas, I think, a bigger issue. If you live in a listed house, then you're probably already aware it's going to be difficult and you've got to approach carefully. It's the conservation areas which are much broader, which are much more of a challenge. And I'm just not convinced that we have at the front of our minds, we want to make this easy for people in the same way that I see best practice in other authorities doing that. And that, there are ways of at the moment we make it more difficult through an Article 4 direction in some areas, and we could make it easier through an LDO in other areas. But I think a much more important, well, maybe not more important, but a bigger overarching issue is that if we came as would-be customers in the way that Anna's just described, and so on, came to the council and said, I want to do this, how do I go about it? It is very difficult to get that answer. Very difficult indeed, unless you are an expert, and we are collectively, and our population collectively are not. And I think that's probably where I would want to go with a significant recommendation as to how we set out. So what's the first response that we get? Is this difficult? This is difficult. You've got to approach with caution, or is it we think you should do this, we want to help you do it? And at the moment, I think we're much too much of the former and not nearly enough of the latter. Anyway, that was a kind of comment on where we're at with that. David, I just want to quickly recap for the panel members where I think we're at. I think we have that as a possible recommendation emerging. I think we have something around LDOs and the workings of the Article 4 directions, which I want to kind of think about how we frame. Catherine's raised the issue of community projects as examples and whether the guidance can assist community projects, and the issue of whether we can have more domestic examples in amongst the larger scale issues. But I think that's where I've currently got written down. But I'm going to let Catherine come in now, David, and then we'll move back to you.
And thank you, Alex, because I think you've captured some of the points that I wanted to communicate. And I think one of the points related to the order that we referred to before, and this Article 4, this is local development order in the Article 4, this is all new language for me, but essentially what it boils down to, that at the moment, it seems as if our default level of harm is that these things are substantially going to cause harm, whereas certainly my personal view, and I don't know whether it's acceptable, this, and of course it's all personal, but I strongly think, given we've said that there's a climate emergency and that we realise that we need to both mitigate and adapt to climate change, that actually the level of harm of not doing it is actually more, and that therefore, we ought to take a kind of default position that the level of harm is less than substantial for implementing solar, which seems to be, the approach that Kensington and Chelsea have taken as the public benefit of having solar as part of, adaptation and mitigation. All these different measures that we're looking at will outweigh the level of harm, whether that's in terms of the visual impact. I understand on Hayfield Road, on one side of the street, that faces the canal, you wouldn't be able to put solar panels there because you might see it from the canal. I'm sorry, but the street there looks quite similar. I mean, I know it's a different classification because it's in a conservation area, but there are lots of Victorian terraces throughout the whole of the city. It was a political decision that that's a conservation area and somewhere else isn't. And so, when we think about harm, we have to think that there is going to be substantial harm to us if we don't do these things. The other thing is about public and private benefit and harm. There is a this default level or concern that the installation of solar might be interpreted as private or personal benefit because you're generating for yourself. But my understanding is that although you might be generating for yourself and you could be putting some of that energy back to the grid, the benefit of you doing that, actually, although you might have some benefit to yourself, is actually going to be a wider societal benefit because of this need to address the urgency of climate change. And so there would be a public benefit that outweighs that private and personal benefit, in line with our targets as a city and a county as well. So I don't know how this can be shaped into a recommendation, and it might be separate from or connected to this local development order point, but essentially the default position that I think there would be many people in the city that would be looking for is that the installation of solar is and these other measures that you're putting is the default position, that it's allowed as opposed to the default position that it's not allowed because it's going to harm the visual amenity, or it's going to only be for private benefit. So don't know whether I've overstepped the mark.
No.
I just hear it all the time from residents. And it's
I think you raised an important issue. The challenge here is that the nature of benefit is defined by the courts, not by the council. So the nature of public and private benefits been defined by various court judgments. So I think we probably don't want to kind of get involved in sort of challenging those, not least because the cabinet will respond by going, you can't. So I think in terms of our recommendation, we need to come at it more obliquely, or more creatively, or more positively, however we want to put it. And that could be around exploring things like the Kensington Chelsea LDO, which is a listed building one rather than a conservation area one. It could be around reviewing. We have 2 Article 4 directions, which are different because of when they were implemented. And we could look at whether there's guidance there. But I think the point is absolutely right, the one that you make, which is that I think we need to, even if we can't challenge what the courts have decided about the narrow legal definitions of these things, we need, in the way that we approach them and the messages that we send to would-be applicants, that we wish to support them in helping their way through this process, rather than essentially saying this is a challenge. So I think we need to reflect on exactly how to do it. But I think that's absolutely understood, and I think there's a clear consensus around that. Emily, I'm afraid we've talked at great length, and it's a long time since you've had an opportunity to say anything. Did you want to add anything to this, or are we heading towards kind of a conclusion?
I'm happy with the discussion. Thank you for thinking of me, but I'm not adding value here, so I'm listening and learning.
In which case, I think probably where I'm heading for is David, who was wanting to come in, and I'm going to ask him to come in now, and then Louise, and then I'm going to try and summarise where we've got to.
Thanks, Alex, but no, it's absolutely fine. I think the really good conversation, lots of really good recommendations, some of which will fall into how can you bring this town forward, and some will fall into the part of how do we move things forward more generally and more holistically. So no, that's great. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for that. I'm not going to try and write the precise wording of the recommendations now. What I'm going to suggest is that Alice and I look at what we have from the transcripts, as it were, of the meeting, and then if we need to sort of wording backwards and forwards with the panel members to make sure we've reflected accurately everybody's views, we will do that, and we will try and do that obviously as quickly as possible before the end of the week. But I think what we're probably looking at then, in terms of the document itself, some recommendations around glossary, around language, and around examples, which are ways of enhancing this document. I think we would have a recommendation. So I hope you're minuting this, because at this point I'm relying on some scribbled notes. I think we have a recommendation around user experience. I think we have some assumptions. I think we heard in the responses about what the user experience is, but I'm not sure that we're terribly confident that those assumptions are accurate. So I think we would probably want to ensure that we are talking to, and more importantly, listening to people who are trying to do this, whether it's organizations like Low Carbon Hub, or whether it's individuals trying to, deal with glazing in a conservation area or whatever it might be. What's their experience? How is that influencing things? And then I think we need to have a broader recommendation, or two broader recommendations. One is about using LDOs and Article 4s. I need to come up with the wording of that. I think it's review the working of the existing Article 4s, look at whether LDOs are an appropriate route signal and more supportive attitude. And then the final recommendation, it's possible we may turn these on their heads, so the broadest recommendation first, but the final recommendation is one around making it clear that the council supports retrofit work in conservation areas and will go out of its way to ensure that that's as easy a process as possible, and that we will help people, hold people's hands through the process in a way I think we are not currently doing. Louise, as the cabinet member, one of the cabinet members, do you want to have a final word?
Thank you, Alex. Just 2 points. One, I think we've got very clearly that we want this to be a document that is going to make it easy for residents to use. So that comes out very clearly. But my second thing is really a question. Is I just want to clarify how we are going to be responding to your recommendations, because this isn't something that's going to cabinet, I don't think. So my understanding really is we will, write them up. We will take them away, and the planning team will then do their best to work them up into the TAN itself. But I don't think this will be coming back to you. This won't be going to cabinet. But just to say, Anna and I will be looking at it with the policy team to try and make sure everything that you recommend gets incorporated. Is that okay?
Alice, can you just clarify the process for something that's not a cabinet report, so everyone's clear?
Yeah, of course. So what we've done before is there's the item that goes to every cabinet meeting on scrutiny reports. So the scrutiny panel would still form a report and recommendations in the usual way, get responses in the usual way, and then they'd be presented to cabinet for sort of a formal response.
Okay, thank you very much. Is everyone clear about that?
Yeah.
And most importantly, Alice, are you clear that you've got the recommendations in their broad brush strokes?
Yeah.
And Catherine or Emily, have I missed anything or any nuance to those things which you'd prefer picked up in a slightly different way?
I thought you captured it very well, so very happy with that. The one question really is, do we or should we have a recommendation that the council sends a letter to national government about flagging the constraints that we're operating, because we keep on referring back to the constraints of the policy, the planning policy framework, and that this is preventing us doing things that we want to do. And so, is there a message that we need to send to national government, and through suggesting that there is a letter that is sent to them? Not that it will make a difference necessarily, but just wondered whether there was some way of making that known, given the UK's net zero targets, which we are contributing to through our city and county plans.
I think my personal preference would be to ask that the cabinet member and the head of planning make that sort of message clear through the channels they already have. I think the slight danger is if we put it in our recommendations, then it may be, writing the letter and saying we're hamstrung becomes the issue. Whereas I think we've identified, looking at what other councils are doing and best practice, there are ways which we can already do better. And I think that's probably what I'd want to focus on. But I'm sure Louise and David have heard and will respond accordingly. And David's already put his hand up.
I was just going to say, if memory serves, I'm pretty sure we included those kinds of things in our responses to at least the last round, and I would assume all rounds of the consultations on the white paper and NPPF in the last few years, because it's been quite high in our mind, this kind of constraint that we're working within.
Right, so that was item 7. Thank you very much. That was a really, I think, thorough discussion of the issues, and thank you for not disappearing into the weeds of the technicalities, even though we did at one point discuss triple glazing, but I think in the appropriate context. So at that point, those who were here for item 7 but not for item 8 can say goodbye. Thank you very much for giving out some of your evenings. It is much appreciated. And we will move to item 8. We have Mish, who else do we still have? Rose, Tristan, Matt. Yeah. Who are all here. I believe you have a presentation. I think I asked you to make it as short as possible and focus on, because this is something that's been discussed already by the panel, focus on things which are new and things where the panel can add value. If you have information you wish to share to us that doesn't share with us, doesn't fall under those, please circulate the slides afterwards. So who, Anna Railton, I think, to begin with. No, that was a head shake.
Maybe I could just set the scene briefly, because you'll see that we have Tristan here, who's the council's ecologist, and he will provide an overview of the work we're doing currently, both on in response to the Environment Act and also on the biodiversity strategy. But we also helpfully have Matt Whitney here, who's the partnership manager for the Local Nature Partnership, and we just thought it's really useful for him to come along to just give sort of a bit of a wider view of what's actually happening strategically across the county as well. So I think, Tristan, if I hand over to you, and then Matt will follow up. The panel is happy with that, Chair.
Thank you. And Chair, are you happy for me to share slides just in the background as I'm talking? Brilliant.
That was a muted yes.
Yeah, it was a muted yes. Sorry, I wasn't paying attention to the on-off switch. Do you have the power to do it?
I believe I do. Let's establish that now.
Yeah, you're good. Can I just check? Others can see that. Emily, and yeah, Emily says yes. Catherine, where is Catherine?
I'm here.
Oh, you're there. Good.
Yeah, I can see it. It's perfect.
Good, good. Right, far away.
Thank you. So, broadly speaking, the narrative about how the council is thinking about biodiversity is unchanged, in the sense that it's always sought to improve it in a variety of ways, some of which you'll have heard about before. But what is new is a lot about the legislative framework we're operating in is changing or has changed. And that affects how we think about various aspects of biodiversity, how we allocate resources, and how the council will be held accountable for its actions as well. And I've split these changes broadly into 5 different categories, which are outlined here. In the interests of brevity, I am going to run through each of these, but avoid being pulled into the technical detail and just try and stick to the key points of interest. Some of these I'm sure will be more familiar with, starting with point number 1, biodiversity net gain. Others, the strengthened biodiversity duty, the new reporting requirements on the council, our role in the county-wide local nature recovery strategy. I imagine some of the information I'm going to share there might be a bit more novel, and the commitment to produce the biodiversity strategy I will touch on briefly at the end, as you've alluded to there, Chair. That's something you're very familiar with. So starting with net gain, I'll assume a general baseline knowledge of the principles behind net gain, leaving land better than you found it. And the fact that at the moment, the Oxford Local Plan does require certain developments to deliver this, but the quantum of net gain is going to increase with legislative requirements, as is the number of applications that need to demonstrate it. So this just highlights the existing policy G2 of the local plan. I've underlined 2 parts there in red, which note that major sites that have become vegetated currently have to demonstrate net gain using a biodiversity metric, and they need to demonstrate an improvement of 5% or more from the existing situation. So this is going to change under the Environment Act, which it's achieved royal assent, but the requirements relevant to biodiversity net gain have not come into force at this point in time. We've recently received guidance that the requirements relating to large sites or major development will come into force from November this year. And for small sites or minor applications, that will be from April 2024. And just as an aside, householder applications are exempt from the requirements to demonstrate net gain through a biodiversity metric. Some of the key requirements under legislation you may be familiar with. The headline points a minimum of 10% net gain. Habitat that's going to be delivered towards that must be secured and managed for at least 30 years. And where this is done off-site, there's going to be a new biodiversity net gain register created and maintained by Natural England to ensure an element of transparency around where the funds go and how they're spent. As this relates to the council, because we already have a requirement relating to net gain, a lot of this work has already been undertaken. However, that's very much been an interim approach working with our current policy. A lot of this needs to be rethought ahead of the legislative requirements being introduced, and the slow drip feed of information from a national level has not especially helped with preparations, but more is starting to come through. Broadly speaking, some of the work involved from the point of view of delivery, there's reviewing the metrics.
Tristan, can I just pause you on this one, because I think this is one of the things we said we would do as part of our future work program. I think we could probably acknowledge this is difficult, and where we'd want to look at is progress on these tasks or lack thereof, preferably none of the lack thereof. But at a future meeting, would that be helpful? I think if it just speeds you through this bit.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I was planning to skip the next section as well, where I was specifically going to talk about biodiversity offsetting and some of the challenges around that. But that, I think, very firmly falls under point 5 of your work plan. So, Chair, perhaps I'll skip through those as well.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks.
Okay, well, that brings us to the enhanced biodiversity duty. So the council previously had a statutory duty to conserve biodiversity under the Natural Environment and Rural Communities Act, commonly known as the NERC Act. However, at the beginning of this year, this was revised to become a duty to conserve and enhance biodiversity. And at the base of the slide there, I've just snipped the relevant portion of the legislation, which essentially says from time to time, the council has to consider what action it can take consistent with the proper exercise of its functions to further this objective to conserve and enhance biodiversity. There's an emphasis in reaching this objective on focusing on habitats and species of principal importance, and it's critical that in making our consideration of the objective that we have regard to the local nature recovery strategy, which I'll be coming on to a little bit later. This is an imminent work stream in the sense of this first consideration required under the revised NERC Act is due at the end of this year, and thereafter will be repeated every 5 years. So the way we're approaching this is to collate information from across the council to understand past, present and proposed future actions in the sphere of biodiversity and ecology. And then ultimately we'll seek to assess how effective those actions have been and seek to establish what barriers there are to essentially going one step further, which I would suppose I would frame that as a kind of baseline exercise where we understand the current place and think about whether there is anything we can do to go beyond conserve and seek to enhance more proactively than we currently do. So that's one key element. Reporting requirements was the third on my list at the start. In addition to undertaking this work and work related to net gain, the council is now due to provide additional reports as to how it progresses with both elements of work. This isn't due until 2025, so there's not an immediate rush to think about this, but it's useful to bear in mind that there's a more stringent framework for how we'll be reporting our actions when it comes to documenting the work we undertake in the intervening period. And again, this is just a snippet of the legislation. I don't expect you to read this all here, but I include it just to show that there are quite strict requirements about what needs to be in these reports. And again, guidance is being drip fed from a national level about how to go about some of these tasks. I alluded to a local nature recovery strategy, which again is something required by the Environment Act. And the idea really is just to prioritize the actions that we take on a county level towards enhancing ecology and biodiversity. And it's expected that Oxfordshire County Council will be the responsible authority for producing this. And there I've listed a few key objectives for the LNRS: agreeing priorities for nature's recovery, mapping the most valuable existing areas for nature, and mapping specific proposals for creating or improving habitat. Now, in terms of our role as Oxford City Council, we will be a supporting authority in this process. So we'll be feeding into the data collation, the mapping, the analysis, and really what's expected from us as a supporting authority is to ensure that the information dovetails with the planning system, so there aren't sort of competing ways that land is being thought about at a county or a city or district level, and also that the LNRS as it's produced reflects local thinking on biodiversity net gain. And then briefly to alight upon the biodiversity strategy, this is obviously something that's been committed to, and a paper was presented to and discussed at Cabinet about this. The first step there was agreed was to form a steering committee, and invitations have been issued seeking quite wide representation on this committee, and we're due to host the first meeting in July. The next step will be the baseline exercise, putting together various disparate sources of data and really aiming to produce a baseline state of nature in Oxford. And I'll be taking proposals for how to go about that exercise to the first steering committee for feedback and consideration. And then we'll be building on the work from there. But I will stop there. That's an outline of. Apologies. Let's see if I can just cancel.
Yeah, you've unshared. Is that the right word?
That's
just share.
That is. Thank you.
Right. Thank you for that. A quick question from me to start off, and then I will see if the other panel members want to come in as well. On the biodiversity duty, so this is the work with a deadline of the 31st of December this year. Particularly interested in the kind of, I suppose, what would it be? The measuring effectiveness of past actions process. How are you going to go about identifying what the past actions were, how far back, and how will you measure their effectiveness?
So my focus to date has been on the identification part of that, because there have been previous efforts to map or collate different actions taken by different service areas, principally the Biodiversity Action Plan 2015 to 2020, which thought about biodiversity in a planning sense, but also the role of the council as a landowner and a community facilitator. However, there hasn't been really a systematic documentation of where those objectives were taken. So the way I'm approaching that is asking each relevant service area to nominate a key point of contact on all issues of biodiversity, and I will be undertaking an interview with each of them one by one to sort of talk through what was in that document, or where the relevant service area was represented, or what might have been represented in other plans, and from there sort of build out the understanding of how has it been thought about, what actions have been taken. And I think only when I've taken that first step will I then be able to think how best to analyze the efficacy of what has been done, or what gaps need to be identified and thought about.
Okay, thank you. That's really, I asked because the deadline seems relatively pressing, and having been looking at the tree strategy earlier, that discusses tree strategy in the sense of biodiversity, in the sense of the tree strategy. Not totally clear that it had an action plan with it, and therefore, if you're just asking, did your service area appear to think about biodiversity, I imagine many will respond to say, yeah, of course we did. Measuring whether the effectiveness of that thinking was, the results of that thinking, it might be slightly more challenging, but harder to pull out. So maybe a recommendation sort of emerging around that, but probably agreeing with what you're already doing. Catherine or Emily, did you want to add anything? I don't want to go back over what was done in the recommendations from the last meeting, if it's all possible, trying to pick up new things.
Thank you for this. I mean, one point that keeps on coming up is how we can be influencing the businesses that are operating within Oxford, and the relevance of that to our biodiversity commitment. So, could you maybe clarify whether there is any obligations that we have, or anything that you would suggest that we are doing that is perhaps within, maybe not our direct control, but in our influence, given that increasingly nature is being valued in a different way than it was before, because of the natural capital accounting and that sort of thing. And then just in terms of your earlier point you referred to about gaps, where do you think there are gaps at the moment that we're going to be having to flag within this report? Will you be assessing things like also the pilot of having green roofs on the bus shelters, for instance? Because I know that there are a few examples where that has existed, but it seems to be there are plenty of barriers for us rolling that out more broadly within the city. So if you could clarify whether that comes within scope of what you're looking at. Thank you.
Do you want to pick those up? Just in answering the first question, if you could kind of identify what hat the council would be wearing with the responsibility, if it's as landlord or something different.
Okay, so starting with the first question relating to businesses, there isn't a specific obligation around how to think about that particular relationship or area for influence that I'm aware of. It might be that as guidance is released about what's within the scope of the exercise, that consideration exercise, it might be that's alluded to. So far, the guidance has been quite broad about what potentially falls underneath it. My first thought is that the current engagement with businesses is probably largely through planning and DM. So it comes from the point of view of, I have my hat on, of responding to planning applications, providing advice to planners that's fed back into the developers about what they can be doing in the way of enhancements. That's relatively indirect. I can't today identify a more direct way that we're working with businesses on the point of biodiversity. I also think there's perhaps slightly less scope to than other stakeholders, for example, whether that's in the area of academia, charity, or community groups. I think it's slightly harder to see the potential pathways for influence. That certainly will form part of the consideration for the biodiversity strategy, but I think that's my honest account on that point. You mentioned specifically the bus shelters, and I'm not today aware of which service area was responsible for those, but absolutely that's the sort of thing I would expect to be covered and fed back of, okay, this has been attempted, this is where it was successful, or this is why it wasn't. And then if it's a case of this is why it wasn't, you mentioned barriers there to progress, that then becomes sort of past the first consideration, that becomes part of the exercise of, well, is there anything we can do about that? Or is it a case of those barriers exist, so resources and energies are better spent somewhere else? And apologies, Councillor, I think you had a query in between businesses and bus shelter, but it slipped my mind.
Yeah,
We covered
I think
everything.
you've covered everything. Thank you.
Yeah, yeah,
Thank you.
that's right. Mai.
Yeah, I just want to say, I guess, I think the most direct opportunity we have around engaging with businesses and where it's relevant on the agenda is through SETCOP currently. So obviously actually those businesses are also interested in this work area. So that there is not currently a sprint, as we call them, on that, but I think that's an opportunity there, and we know that definitely some of the members are very interested. And Chair, I'll leave it to you when to bring in Matt Whitney, but I just say, I guess in this space, and obviously the LNP, you know, there's sort of the broader view and quite a bit of engagement as well with bigger businesses as well.
Yeah, happy to bring Matt in a minute. So Matt, be poised, but not just yet. Can I just ask, just on picking up on the question of the businesses, council is of course a landlord, including an agricultural landlord. Do we have any responsibilities and or scope to influence there? I mean, certainly we're an urban council. These biodiversity duties are very important in urban areas. They are extremely important in rural areas where you know, we're talking much larger hectareage, if that's the right word.
I'll answer hypothetically, because I could see, yes, there being a role there. I imagine that where we are landlords of agricultural land, that this land will be subject to pre-agreed tenancies of various lengths. However, I could see an opportunity when it comes to tenancies being renewed, renegotiated, thought about, that perhaps we seek to work with the tenants to understand, are there any opportunities there that work for both them and for us for enhancing biodiversity? I say hypothetically because I'm not aware of it, but it may be that work is already being undertaken by the Green Spaces team. But that is something I would certainly hope to draw out in the process of the consideration of the biodiversity duty.
Okay, I think from memory that agricultural tenancies sit under property, and I think they're the traditional grandfathered, so 3 generations agricultural tenancies, so the standard form of agricultural tenancy, so they vary significantly. I think possibly we might have a recommendation to kind of help support your work with council as landlord. I'm not going to specify the agricultural tenancies because we're a commercial landlord of a whole range of other properties as well. So maybe just to kind of strengthen your hand, as it were, in terms of approaching that side of the council. Emily.
And it kind of links to the business point, but it's actually just about the university. I mean, thinking about what makes kind of Oxford City unique, there is just a lot of space that is owned by the university, by colleges, that's kind of potential to increase biodiversity in. In my ward, thinking about Angel and Greyhound Meadow, for example, I just don't know. And just the Vice Chancellor's Awards in Senior last week, one of the runners-up was like Christchurch's water meadow biodiversity increase. I don't really know much about this topic, but I suppose reflecting the question about businesses, are we doing enough with the university, with the colleges? Could we do more? Could we do more with Brooks? I don't know what Brooks ownership looks like. Those other institutions. That's question A. And then question B, kind of unrelatedly, is what other local authorities are doing a really good job of this, and can we learn from them? And the answer to that, by the way, might be no one, because I think it was previously. But can I just sort of repeat that question to see if anyone else has got any ideas? Thank you.
Tristan, before you come in, is this a good opportunity to bring Matt in? Don't lose those questions, Tristan. You may need to come back to you. I just want to see whether Matt wants to add anything at this stage.
Yeah, very happy to. So hello, everybody. Really nice to meet you. I'm Matt Whitney. I'm the local nature partnership manager. I've met one or two of you before, but there's one or two of you whom I haven't met. So yeah, a pleasure. I've got a really short presentation to do. The brevity aspect was made very clear to me, so I'll rattle through it. I don't know if you want me to do that now, but I can try and address Emily's 2 questions first.
Let's deal with Emily's questions and note a possible couple of recommendations emerging from those, and then we'll come on to yours and see whether there's any recommendations out of that. So Tristan, do you want to just pick up those 2 points that Emily made?
Absolutely. So part A, is there scope to do more? Yes. And one of the work streams related to the biodiversity strategy is going to be understanding what is within the scope of the strategy and subsequent action plan or action plans to meaningfully achieve. And part of that has to be starting with the question of what can we as the council do for you as other stakeholders. And part of that is going to be just increasing awareness between different parties and trying to facilitate the exchange of knowledge. Some areas I'm aware of, mentioning colleges, some of their lands are currently designated as local wildlife sites, Oxford City wildlife sites, and have quite high biodiversity value. Other areas, not so much. There might be competing uses between them, but understanding sort of what best practice some colleges are following, whether that's transferable among others, drawing from beyond just their network into sort of broader habitat management being undertaken by other parties in Oxford and the surrounding area, I see as a real area of focus. In terms of, is there any best practice? The obvious and potentially lazy comparison would be Cambridge, but it is worth noting because they have recently produced a biodiversity strategy of their own that I have read and taken notes on when thinking about how to approach our own. And I think that there probably would be a useful conversation to be had there in the production of the strategy, as well as we start to draw out potential comparisons or contrasts between them.
Okay, I'm just going to sketch out 3 quick recommendations, which I think are not previously covered by the recommendations from the last panel meeting. So in no particular order, they would be in relation to the biodiversity duty. Would you call it a baselining exercise, Tristan? Is that right? The one that's got the deadline for the end of this year, whatever. Yeah,
that was off the top of the head, but yes, that sort of.
I think we'd want a recommendation about ensuring the council as landlord, so the council's landlord function, both as a housing landlord, but in particular as an institutional landlord. So business premises and agricultural premises is reflected in the biodiversity audit. What have we tried to do up to now? Has it worked? Function. I think we'd want a recommendation along the lines of what Emily just said, which is, I've said learning from / working with. I don't want to say sound as if they do it better. So something around collaborating with to mutual benefit, or something other institutions and landowners. Worth bearing in mind the NHS, of course, is a very large institutional landowner of green space across the city, and as well as the 2 universities and the constituent colleges. And then the 3rd recommendation would be continue to seek out emerging best practice in other local authorities. I'm sure that'll be a nice, easy one to agree with, but it'll give us a handle to attach any kind of which ones have you learned from since we last asked kind of conversation. Alice, I hope those are okay. And then I think we're going to pick up Matt's brief presentation. So if you can share. Catherine, I will come back to you. I saw that hand come and go. Perhaps while Matt's getting his presentation up, we'll do that.
It was just whether there was a recommendation from what Mai mentioned around this engaging with business through ZCOP on a sprint on biodiversity. It might not be relevant, but just wanted to.
Just to check, Mai, you said there isn't a biodiversity sprint in ZCOP at the moment?
There isn't, no. And while the City Council chairs or hosts the SETCOP, we can't impose things on it. So I think we can recommend that it's something
we can request. Let's not get over presumptuous. Can we request? Can we ask nicely?
We can ask nicely. We can suggest, yes.
Yeah. Well, perhaps if we'll add that as a recommendation that suggests that the City Council, or ask that the City Council suggests that ZCOP adds a work stream on biodiversity to its existing work streams, without wanting to kind of say how that would be. So, Matt, far away.
Fantastic. I'm Matt Whitney. I manage the local nature partnership in Oxfordshire. The LNP, as it's known, exists to radically enhance nature, its positive impact on our climate, the priority it's given, helping to make Oxfordshire a county where people and nature thrive. The main thing to pick out of that is that this isn't nature for nature's sake. This is nature for the wider benefits that it brings to, yes, wildlife, but also the economy and society. We're trying to work with other policy areas and other work streams to highlight the kind of the value that nature brings to whether it's planning, whether it's businesses and carbon sequestration. So this is a really boring slide, but what it serves to show you is I'm employed by Southern Vale in their strategic partnerships team. I sit next to the FOP manager within that group. But my role might just as easily be hosted by any of the constituent partner organisations. We've got a representative board on which sits Councillor David Ruane as a representative of, I think is it EOG or EAG, one of the two. And then there's also Ian Boll, who's a strategic director at Cherwell District Council. So they're the two local authority representatives on our board. Wider partnership context, already done that. It's all that strategic vision stuff that I think you all know very well. The partnership is made up of loads of different partners, and this hopefully serves to re-emphasise the point I made earlier. This isn't just nature for nature's sake. You know, we're working with the farming sector, NFU, CLA, and others are on there. We're working with the private sectors and with private businesses who are engaged with this, and I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a moment. The statutory agencies, so Natural England, Forestry Commission, Environment Agency are all part of the partnership, sit on the board as well. All of the local authorities are key partners of the partnership and are indeed our funders, and obviously the wildlife NGOs as well. So there's three main areas where we focus: nature recovery, natural capital or nature finance, and people and nature. On the local nature recovery bit, our main job is supporting OCC, the county council, as the responsible authority to produce the local nature recovery strategy, which Tristan's already gone into. I also sit on the steering group Tristan mentioned for the Oxford biodiversity strategy. So my role there really is to ensure that we don't duplicate effort in any baselining or work or anything like that, and to make sure there's real alignment between the county-wide strategy and the city strategy. Now, clearly you may have different priorities, but I hope that the decision about what is the priority is made from the same set of principles and evidence. And, you know, as a county-wide partnership manager, I'm always going to push that line, but obviously Oxford City will produce the right strategy for Oxford City. Natural capital, the main bits of work there is around nature finance. We've produced the Oxfordshire Nature Finance strategy, which is all looking at how we're going to leverage private money from businesses to invest in nature's recovery and natural capital enhancement. Again, a bit more on that in a second. And then the third area of work is people and nature. So this is everywhere that nature interacts with health and well-being. So that might be green infrastructure through the planning system, or it might be more nature-rich, accessible green spaces for people to visit and enjoy. Progress to date. So we've been working. We are the project lead for one of the 5 priorities within the PASCO Net Zero Roadmap and Action Plan. So that's on the land-based carbon sequestration piece, and we're actually going to be hopefully recruiting pretty soon for some resource to deliver that bit. So that's all about how to create carbon credits from land-based initiatives, and not just tree planting, where we've already got a solid carbon code in the Woodland Carbon Code, but can we create carbon credits from other habitat restoration or creation that we know also sequesters carbon. And with that work, we're working really closely with Oxford City's area-based insetting approach, the Anthesis work. They've already done a lot of work about a suite of carbon insets for businesses, and those businesses have fed back that they really want to spread their risk across not just kind of renewable energy and retrofit, but also they want some land-based projects. So hopefully the LNP work can really tie in with that nicely. Other bits we're involved in is some guiding principles for biodiversity net gain. So Tristan's involved in the working group on that, how we can get the most out of BNG. One of the bits we've been doing on that is to produce an evidence base that can support the local planning authorities where they decide to require more than 10% biodiversity net gain through their planning system. A number of the LPAs in Oxfordshire are looking to do that, and a number of LPAs nationally have already got that through the inspectorate, that their local plan now asks for 20 or 25% net gain across the board. The LNP supports that, but yeah, Tristan and I have had this one for a while, so I understand the council's current position on that, so that's fine. And this nature finance strategy I mentioned, leveraging private money. So we have been doing a lot of engagement with businesses. We've been doing a lot of engagement with the colleges as well. Well, as much as one can, some anyway. And we've been convening county-wide conversations with the colleges on how they can do more with their land. But we're going to be looking to FOP initially, and then to all the constituent authorities for endorsement of that nature finance strategy in due course. And that's me. So yeah, very happy to answer any questions you've got on that.
Cheers, Matt. Thank you. I had one question, but I'm very conscious that we are a panel of Oxford City Council scrutiny function, and so potentially we're slightly disconnected from the bits you're answerable to, which is the FOP. But one key element, and I need to think about if we form a recommendation around this, how precisely it would be worded. But clearly the work that you're doing around biodiversity could overlap with issues around nature recovery, could overlap with biodiversity issue, but also issues around, for example, flooding. Wetlands are a very good way to increase biodiversity. They're also a good way to prevent flooding, which is a concern. I don't want to kind of get into the existing flood alleviation scheme, which this council is a strong supporter of, but clearly there are other parts of the county which are susceptible to flooding. So how does your work interact with that strategic level stuff that, say, the Environment Agency might be looking at? And we can put this in a little bit of out of Oxford context, in that the Abingdon flood scheme was deemed to be not good value for money and didn't proceed. But there's still an issue there with flooding, and even our own flood scheme won't prevent all flooding. So but it's a question about the process. How are you working to ensure that biodiversity and nature recovery aren't seen as separate to other strategic objectives?
That's absolutely at the core of all of the work that the LNP does. It's not just nature for nature's sake, it's nature for the wider environmental benefits it brings. One of the most exciting and I think potentially effective kind of new things that's come about in the last few years in this space is farmer clusters. There's possibly one of the most effective farmer clusters nationally is the North East Cotswolds farmer cluster, and they've been successful in getting tons of funding. They're one of the very first landscape recovery project areas, and what they've done is they've done a baseline map of their land, And then they've modelled what a 1% increase in soil carbon across that geography would do. Obviously, that sequesters loads of carbon. Good news, people can, whether the farmers can claim that carbon as their own, whether those farmers might want to sell that carbon, regardless, it's good news. And it also produces, better food through regenerative farming practices. They also modelled the potential flood alleviation. So the increased capacity for water storage that a 1% increase in soil organic matter would have across that geography. And it was the scale of thousands of OFASs of the benefit that the reduction in peak flows that it could potentially bring, or the amount of water, increased water that it could hold. It was mega. So there's lots of ways in which the LNP is working in this space. We're a convener, we're a facilitator. We're not delivering land-based projects, but partners are, and we're trying to share best practice and help the other farmer clusters, deliver similar approaches, so we can have really great catchment-wide approaches to flood alleviation across the county.
Yeah, I completely and absolutely endorse that last point about carbon sequestration and indeed flood scheme capacity. But I'm just conscious that we need to think where we can add value other than be interested. And while I would happily talk about soils, going back to my allotment association hat, for a long time, I'm not sure it would help. Right. So moving on from soils, Catherine.
Yeah, just with reference to your nature finance strategy, are you looking at insurance at all? Because my understanding, and this is with my day job hat on, is that the insurance sector has been looking at natural capital insurance, and that this is sort of a new field where it can be used to help with the restoration of natural capital and address like coastal and wetland restoration as well, to protect infrastructure and livelihoods. And just wondering whether you're looking at any innovation around that, and whether that could be a mechanism that it is quite new, but whether that would go within that nature finance strategy. Thank you.
The worry here is that you get me set on an area I'm really, really passionate about, and I talk for the whole meeting. So I will avoid that temptation. Aviva have just invested millions of pounds in a nature recovery scheme to the west, and that's really great. But it's a really new area, so that money's not been invested from their actual insurance part. That's essentially CSR money, right? So they're spending that money to test the water, to become excuse the pun, to become a first mover in this space, so they can really develop what they can do to reduce the liabilities of the people they insure against, and then implement that and roll that model out. That's really it's really emergent. It's really exciting. But there's lots of areas that are emergent and exciting within the nature finance space. What we're going to focus on initially are the bits that are a bit more solid. So we've got BNG, there's legislative framework for that. Everybody's going to have to do it. We know the money's going to be there. We've modelled how much money we think will be there across the county with Oxford University. So we've got an idea of what the possibility is in that space. And similarly with carbon, while it's obviously voluntary, not mandatory, we know there's a market there. So they're the places we're going to be looking at first and foremost. But the health and well-being benefits of nature, and how we can get private investors, paying for those benefits is really exciting as well. So yes, insurers is on the list, but it's not at the top at the moment.
Thank you.
Emily, did you want to add anything on this?
No, thank you.
In which case, I think were we to make any recommendations, we would probably be being slightly rude, because we would be telling Matt to do something he's already doing, and the partnership to be doing something it's already doing. So I'm not sure, using our test of can we add value, I'm not sure that we can. Certainly, I'm very interested in the work that you're doing with the farming clusters. I think it is critically important. I've told many people about my experience of the 2007 floods, watching water pouring off fields, like across dual carriageways. It was coming off fields that fast, flying across 4 lanes of traffic. So anything I think that looks at soils is going to be critical. And as a horticulturalist, albeit an inept and amateur one, I think soils have been given insufficient consideration for far too long. But I think we probably don't have any recommendations, so we're going to say thank you to Matt for his presentation, and the fact that we haven't got any recommendations he should take as a tribute to his work.
Fantastic. The only parting shot I'd leave you with is I will be looking for endorsement of that nature finance strategy in time. Clearly you haven't seen it, you can't recommend your cabinet endorses it in any way, but hopefully I can have a chance to bring that back to you at a later date.
Well, we have the cabinet member here, so I'm sure she's poised, ready to endorse as long as she thinks it's worth endorsing.
I mean, I will read it first, but yeah.
There we are.
Right. Thank you very much, everybody.
That's great. In which case, I don't think we have anything more to add on this. So if we're content to move forward, that takes us to item 9, which is the future meetings. Can you note the dates? We're going to carry on doing it online. I think it's fairer on offices. I have to say, personally, I quite like the face-to-face, but the majority consensus was for online. So we'll continue with that. And we will work to start to fill in that programme of work from the previous item. So, oh, sorry, Emily, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, on the not online versus online, is there any argument to have maybe the first meeting of the year or the last meeting of the year in person and then all the others online? Because I know that wasn't actually discussed as an option, I don't think.
What I would say is, if we have an item later on the agenda, later on in the year, where we have an agenda item, perhaps we're bringing in some additional expertise, and we want to have that kind of real face-to-face conversation, I will discuss it with you and the other panel members whether we think that's the right way to go. And so, yeah, don't rule it out. But at the moment, the preference was expressed for this, particularly people with, childcare responsibility.
It was my preference too. But yes, I was just, for that reason. But yeah, great. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you very much, Matt. Really appreciate it. Alice, you have your hand up. Fire away.
Yeah, I was just going to add that scrutiny in that operating principles actually stipulated that standing panels and review groups would generally meet virtually unless there's a compelling need. So like you say, if you're bringing people in, there's definitely a discussion there. But yeah, just to clarify.
Yeah, lovely. In which case, unless we have a compelling need, we will see each other virtually in due course. Alice and I will work on the recommendations over the next 24 hours. Yep. And then circulate them around the panel just to make sure that we've got it right, and then send them on to the relevant cabinet members. Fantastic. Thank you all very much. I hope you found that a productive and interesting session. It was perhaps ever so slightly longer than I'd intended, but I think worth it